Now on to our next guest, Jane Adams, who will be discussing the myths associated with asylum seekers. Jane, you're someone who's been very vocal in recent times about the topics of myths surrounding asylum seekers. What are some of the major misconceptions surrounding these people?
Well, first and foremost is the idea that boat people are queue jumpers. These are people who we haven't invited here, and therefore they are taking the places of refugees who've been waiting in camps in an orderly manner to be resettled. That's one of the biggest myths, because it suggests that refugee camps are systematic, orderly places where you come in with your number, like going to the delicatessen at the supermarket, and you've got your number, and when your number comes up, you get resettled. It doesn't happen like that at all. People, if they can even flee to a refugee camp, and sometimes there isn't one for them to go to, or the journey is so dangerous that they can't get to it. But once they are there, they have to have their claim assessed, and then each year the UNHCR officers there will be asked basically for a list of people who are awaiting resettlement. That list is then considered by the Immigration Department, and the Immigration Department has certain ethnic composition of people they may like, or what nationality is a priority for resettlement at any particular time. They may wish to resettle particularly vulnerable people, but that requires those people to even be brought to the attention of the resettlement officers, and people have often said the most vulnerable people in refugee camps often don't have spokespeople for them to even bring them to the attention of the resettlement officers. So resettlement is somewhat of a lottery, and there are millions of people who have been living for at least 5 years or more in a refugee camp with no prospect of resettlement or any other durable solution forthcoming. Another myth, of course, is that asylum seekers are terrorists. Now, fortunately, that's dropped off the political agenda a little bit at the moment, but it was a myth that John Howard used to talk up a lot. There's no link that's been demonstrated between 9/11, for example, and refugees. None of the people involved in 9/11 had ever sought asylum. And quite frankly, why would you? Seeking asylum is one of the most one of the processes that requires the most documentation, the most information to be put before the government. There are other ways you could get into a country without drawing quite so much attention to yourself. There are other myths too, of course, in relation to the numbers. The numbers are completely overblown, I think, in people's minds, and that's a perception that's fuelled by the sensational comments that we hear our politicians and some of the radio shock jocks making.
2013 Galaxy poll was done up and put in the Courier Mail, and it was talking about how a lot of people believed that asylum seekers were economic migrants. From your research, what are the types of people that are seeking refuge or asylum?
Well, the definition of a refugee is someone with a well-founded fear of persecution based on a particular reason, like race or religion or nationality and so on. So these are people who need to get out of their country because their lives or safety are at risk. They are the people who tend to come by boat often feel that they have absolutely nothing to lose. I mean, they are so desperate, they will often pool their resources with other family or community members to try and get themselves passage on a boat to get out of the situation that they are in. Many people will also say that they want to be able to offer their children a future, and they don't simply mean because I'd like them to get a good job, but because they actually want them to have a life, and a life a life lived in dignity as well. If you look at some of the camp situations, or also the urban refugee situations that we have in countries like Indonesia, with people living in urban centres, some of the urban refugees are in even more vulnerable positions than the refugees in camps, because at least in a camp there is some semblance of infrastructure. You are, and actually some real infrastructure too. At least you are getting some food, you are getting basic shelter provided, basic medical care. it's certainly not a place I'd like to be for very long, but those things at least are guaranteed. If you are living in a city as a refugee, you may be treated as like any other person who's there without documents. And so in Malaysia, for example, refugees are often rounded up along with other people without documentation, put in jail. There have been documented cases of whippings and other forms of cruel and inhuman treatment. And these are people exercising their right under international human rights law to seek asylum.
So what you're saying is there is no orderly system for these kind of asylum seekers or refugees that the government's trying to prevent. That's also primarily another myth.
It's not as though you can just turn up to an Australian consulate and say, I'd like a protection visa, please. I mean, that doesn't exist. So the only way out is, if you are a refugee, by definition, you have to flee your country. And the Refugee Convention too, showing how aware the drafters were of the predicament of refugees, actually has an exemption. It says that if you arrive without documents, then you can't be penalised because of that, precisely because the nature of flight and the nature of persecution is such that you may leave in a great hurry, and or because you're being persecuted, you can't turn to your government and say, I'd like a passport, please, because I want to leave, or in some countries, I'd like an exit visa because I want to go. And that's also why Tony Abbott's recent announcement that people who arrived on false documents would not have their claims even processed is again a fundamental breach of the Refugee Convention.
This is a really touchy subject, as I mentioned earlier. Is it possible that people can have a proper public informative debate about this issue, or is it too complicated for most people?
I think some of it is very complicated, but I think there are some fairly basic issues that could be highlighted in a way that would dispel some of the fear that allegedly exists in the community. And that's where I think you need real political leadership. Whether we can have that in Australia at the moment, I don't know. The message is put in such blunt terms that no wonder we haven't got the space there to have a proper and informed debate. But I would like to be optimistic and hope that at some point in the future we can.
Thanks to Jane Adams for that really, really good talk about the myths associated with asylum seekers. Now finally we're going to hear from Najeeba Wazifadost, a Hazara Afghan woman who fled Afghanistan at the age of 12.
My name is Najeeba Wazifadost. I was only 12 years old when I left my country, Afghanistan, and came to Australia by boat in the year of 2000. I have been in Curtin Detention Centre about 2 to 3 months. I have finished my education successfully and I'm a proud Australian citizen today. I don't really have any good memories from my childhood. Everything that I remember was in darkness. We were facing murder and killing and persecution by the hands of almost anyone who could be the Taliban and could have even been the general people, because Afghanistan has been in war for many, many decades. I remember that it was a day when I was in Pakistan, sitting there and basically prisoning ourselves into a small room. My father came and said, we are going to Australia. I did not know anything. I did not know Australia so far. I did not know that I have to come through a big Pacific Ocean. I did not know that I was going to be locked up in detention center. I didn't even know that people in Australia looked different to me. They would have blue eyes. They would not wear scarf the way I'm wearing burqa back then. I thought everybody in the world are just the same as me. When my father came home one day and he said, we are going to Australia, and we said, how did you come up with this decision and plan? And he was saying that there is a person named Smuggler. We were caught several times, we were put in prison, and then finally we got into Indonesia. But one thing that was worrying me the most at that time, rather than thinking about Indonesia itself, was the health of my mother, because she was about 8 months or 9 months pregnant. Till the time that I actually got into the boat, I did not know that we were going to come to Australia by boat. I didn't know how to swim, and we didn't have any equipment with us. We didn't have any resources, no saving jackets, nothing at all. And we were getting into this wooden boat that were limited to almost nothing, and our destiny, our future were relied on that piece of wood that we were going to travel for the next 10 nights, and that was scary. The mothers were all looking at each other with a lot of hatred. The children were scared of each other. Even though that we were from the same ethnicity of Hazara Afghan people in the same boat, we were scared of one another. As we were going backward, everybody, I remember myself, my younger sisters, my father and my mother, we were all thinking, as so many other younger women and girls and males. We were saying that what has been left in our country? There's nothing left in our country. When we were looking towards the back, everything that we used to see was all dark. There was no future for us. There was no hope. But looking towards Australia, we could at least see 1% of light, glowing towards our life. We couldn't speak the language, but we were all kneeling down in front of the Australian Navy Force. But the only thing that we could see was their hands telling us to go back like that. I never forget that as I was holding my father's hand and getting out of the plane and sitting into the bus, and once we got out of the bus, we were in the middle of desert. Truly, it was no one else. It was a big, massive yellow land, so hot. And the only thing that we could see was the wire fences all around a big area. So we found ourselves being locked in a place which Australia calls detention centre, but I call a prison. It was traumatizing, especially for a lot of children. I think it's not the right place to live. Living in detention center basically meant for myself having loss of control and not having any connection with the outer world. I was in constant fear, to be honest. As I said, I thought that if I leave Afghanistan and I come to another country, at least this fear is going to go away from me. But I was in more fear. I was afraid that this is another way of being killed, or this is another way of us being dead. I always wanted to know if I can get out of those fences and feel the freedom, and experience the freedom that I always wanted, experience the security that I always were starving for. But that was not the case again. I just think my personal experience in life has built a stronger person out of myself. I can understand what people can go through from war-torn countries, and I can understand what they can go through in Australian detention centres. And that gives me a greater skills to help those people that are once released out of detention. I call Australia my home. I love Australia, and I love Australia for what they've given me. Today I breathe, I eat, I enjoy, I live is because of Australia. Today that I actually speak English, study, want to become a lawyer or have desires and dreams in my life is because I live in Australia. I've been able to establish goals and objectives in my life. I'm looking towards a life where I'm trying to plan more and more. So this is the beauty of living in Australia.
I personally found it quite interesting to listen to Najeeba's story about where she came from, the situations that she was facing over in Afghanistan, and basically her life story. And I think the great thing is too that from her terrible situation over there, she's been able to, since coming to Australia, turn her life around and is wanting to study law, which is a great thing. I'm actually thinking myself of doing international law, so working with human rights. So I congratulate her on turning her life around and turning such a negative situation into a positive.